The wound that never closes. There is a piece of land smaller than the state of New Jersey that has generated more conflict, more grief, more international crisis, and more theological fury than perhaps any other place on earth. It sits at the intersection of 3 continents and 3 of the world's great religions. Its soil has been fought over by Egyptians and Assyrians, Romans and Crusaders, Ottomans and British, and now by 2 peoples who both believe with absolute conviction that it belongs to them and only to them. The conflict between Israel and Hamas is not a modern diplomatic dispute that clever negotiators failed to resolve. It is not a misunderstanding that better communication could have prevented. It is a collision between 2 narratives of identity, survival, and sacred belonging that are, in their most fundamental forms, mutually exclusive. And the explosion of October 7, 2023, the deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust, did not begin a new conflict. It ripped the mask off a conflict that had never truly ended, that had simply been managed, contained, and periodically suppressed until the pressure became too great to hold. On that morning, over 2,000 Hamas fighters breached the Gaza perimeter fence in 29 locations, poured into Israeli communities, and carried out a massacre of extraordinary savagery. 1,200 people were killed. Men, women, children, elderly Holocaust survivors. 251 people were taken hostage into Gaza. The attack was planned for over a year. It was executed with a precision and brutality that stunned Israeli intelligence, which had confidently believed it had Hamas contained, monitored, and deterred. It was not contained. It was not deterred. And what has followed? The Israeli military campaign in Gaza that has killed tens of thousands, displaced millions, and reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble, has created a humanitarian catastrophe that has shaken the moral foundations of the Western alliance, reshaped the geopolitics of the entire Middle East, and raised questions about the future of the region that nobody has clean answers to. This is the story of what happened, why it happened, and, most urgently, what comes next. Not as a political argument for one side or the other, but as a clear-eyed examination of the forces, the interests, the ideologies, and the decisions that will determine whether this ancient wound finally begins to heal, or whether it tears the region apart in ways that could take generations to recover from. Segment 2. The Making of October 7th. How it happened. To understand October 7th, you need to understand something that most Western observers find deeply counterintuitive. Hamas is not primarily a terrorist organization that happens to have political goals. Hamas is primarily a political and ideological movement, a Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood that uses terrorism as a strategic instrument. The distinction matters enormously because it means that Hamas's decisions, including the decision to launch October 7th, were not the impulsive acts of fanatics. They were calculated strategic choices made by an organization with a coherent, if monstrous, logic. Hamas was founded in 1987. At the beginning of the First Palestinian Intifada, its founding charter called for the destruction of Israel and the establishment of an Islamic state in all of historic Palestine. It built its support base in Gaza not just through violence, but through social services, schools, hospitals, food distribution networks that the corrupt and ineffective Palestinian Authority had failed to provide. In Palestinian eyes, Hamas was not simply a resistance movement. For many, it was the only institution that actually showed up. In 2006, Hamas won Palestinian legislative elections, an outcome that stunned the world and particularly embarrassed the United States, which had been loudly promoting Palestinian democracy. Rather than accept the result, Israel, the United States, and the European Union refused to recognize the Hamas government and imposed economic pressure. In 2007, after a brief and bloody civil conflict with Fatah, the rival Palestinian faction that controls the West Bank, Hamas seized full control of Gaza. The blockade that Israel and Egypt imposed in response has been in place in varying degrees of severity ever since. For 16 years, Gaza under Hamas has been what critics call an open-air prison and what Israeli officials call a necessary security measure. The reality contains elements of both. 2 million people live in one of the most densely populated territories on Earth, with severely restricted movement, limited access to imports, chronic shortages of electricity, clean water, and basic medicines, and an economy so strangled that youth unemployment reached catastrophic levels. An entire generation of Gazans has grown up knowing nothing but the blockade, the periodic military escalations, the sense of being trapped with no visible future. Hamas used this environment as a recruiting tool and a justification. It also used the years of relative calm, punctuated by periodic rocket exchanges and military operations, to prepare. It built an underground tunnel network beneath Gaza, so vast and sophisticated that Israeli military planners call it the Gaza Metro. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, reinforced with concrete, equipped with electricity and ventilation, capable of moving fighters, weapons, and hostages beneath the battlefield. It stockpiled weapons, rockets, anti-tank missiles, explosive drones, smuggled through tunnels from Egypt and supplied by Iran. It trained an estimated 40,000 fighters. And then, on October 7th, it deployed everything it had built in a single, overwhelming assault. The planning was meticulous. Hamas had studied the locations of Israeli communities near the Gaza border, the response times of Israeli military units, the layout of the Nova Music Festival that was taking place that morning near Kibbutz Re'im. They knew exactly where people would be, and exactly how long they had before a serious Israeli military response arrived. The question that haunts Israeli intelligence is the one that haunts every intelligence failure in history. How did they not know? The answer is a combination of institutional arrogance, the conviction that Hamas was deterred and that the intelligence picture was accurate, and remarkable Hamas operational security. The attack was planned in small cells, compartmented in ways that prevented any single source from knowing the full picture. And some warnings that did surface were dismissed as not credible by analysts who had convinced themselves that Hamas would not dare. It dared, and the world changed. Segment 3. Israel's response. The logic of overwhelming force. Israel's response to October 7th was, from the Israeli government's perspective, both inevitable and existential. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that Israel was at war, not another round of escalation, not another operation with a name and a defined endpoint, but war in the full sense. The stated objectives were clear: destroy Hamas's military and governing capacity and bring the hostages home. To understand the scale and ferocity of Israel's military campaign, you must understand the psychological and historical weight that October 7th carried for Israeli society. Israel was founded in the shadow of the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews by a state that had decided the Jewish people had no right to exist. The founding logic of Zionism, and particularly of the Israeli state, is that Jewish people must have a place of safety, a state with the military power to defend itself, so that never again would Jews be slaughtered without the means to fight back. October 7th struck at the deepest nerve of that founding logic. The kibbutzim that were attacked, Be'eri, Kfar Aza, near Oz, were not military installations. They were civilian communities, many of them founded by left-wing Israelis who had believed in coexistence, who had employed Gazan workers, who had driven sick Gazan children to Israeli hospitals. The people who died there were not symbols of occupation. They were families, they were children, and they were killed with a deliberate cruelty, documented in Hamas's own footage, that was designed not just to inflict casualties, but to terrorize, to humiliate, to demonstrate that no Israeli anywhere near Gaza was safe. The Israeli military response, waves of airstrikes followed by a ground invasion of northern Gaza, then southern Gaza, then Rafah, caused destruction on a scale that shocked even experienced war correspondents. Gaza City, Khan Yunis, Rafah, neighborhoods that had existed for generations, were reduced to rubble. The civilian death toll climbed into the tens of thousands. The United Nations declared a humanitarian catastrophe. International courts examined allegations of genocide. Protests erupted on university campuses across the United States and Europe. Israel's government defended the campaign on 2 grounds. First, that Hamas deliberately embeds its military infrastructure, tunnels, weapons storage, command centers, beneath civilian areas, using hospitals, schools, and mosques as shields, making civilian casualties in any genuine military operation against Hamas unavoidable. Second, that the alternative, allowing Hamas to survive, rearm, and repeat October 7th, was simply not acceptable to Israeli society and represented an existential threat to the Jewish state. Both of these arguments contain genuine truth. Hamas does embed its military infrastructure in civilian areas. This is documented and deliberate. a strategy designed to force Israel into a choice between allowing Hamas to operate freely or killing civilians. And the threat Hamas represents to Israeli communities near Gaza is real, not manufactured. But the scale of destruction and the restrictions on humanitarian aid that left Gaza's civilian population facing famine conditions generated a global political crisis for Israel that has profoundly damaged its international standing in ways that will take years to repair. The sight of children dying from preventable starvation while Israel's government restricted aid convoys created a moral rupture between Israel and significant portions of the international community, including many who had stood firmly with Israel in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. The military campaign achieved real results against Hamas's military infrastructure. Senior Hamas commanders were killed, including Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of October 7th, located and killed by Israeli forces in October 2024. The tunnel network was significantly degraded. Hamas's ability to operate as a conventional military force was severely damaged. But it did not destroy Hamas. And the question of what comes after, who governs Gaza, whether Hamas can reconstitute, whether the conditions that created October 7th have been changed or simply made worse, remains the central question that Israel's military campaign, for all its ferocity, has not answered. Segment 4. The hostage dimension, the unbearable weight. At the heart of this conflict, cutting through every geopolitical analysis and strategic calculation, is a human reality so raw and painful that it defies the cold language of international relations. 251 people, Israelis and foreign nationals, including babies and elderly Holocaust survivors, were dragged from their homes and taken into the tunnels of Gaza on October 7th. Their faces were on posters across Israel and across the world. Their names were chanted at protests. Their families became the conscience of Israeli society, the constant, agonizing reminder that the war was not just about destroying Hamas or restoring deterrence, but about human beings sitting in tunnels in the dark, not knowing if anyone was coming for them. The hostage crisis created a fundamental strategic tension within Israel that has never been fully resolved. The military campaign most likely to destroy Hamas, relentless, comprehensive, with no pauses, was also the campaign most likely to get the hostages killed, either deliberately by their captors or as casualties of Israeli military operations. Ceasefire negotiations that might bring hostages home required concessions, pauses in fighting, prisoner releases, eventual agreements that would allow Hamas to survive and regroup. Netanyahu's government, a fragile coalition that included far-right ministers who openly opposed any deal that would end the war before Hamas was completely destroyed, found itself unable to resolve this tension cleanly. Far-right finance minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir threatened to collapse the government if Netanyahu agreed to any deal they considered insufficiently total in its destruction of Hamas. The hostages' families, organized, vocal, and morally impossible to dismiss, demanded that their government prioritize human lives over military objectives. Qatar and Egypt, serving as mediators between Israel and Hamas, brokered a series of partial deals, most notably a pause in November 2023, during which over 100 hostages were released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. But the larger deal that would end the war and release all remaining hostages remained elusive, trapped between Hamas's insistence on a permanent ceasefire and Israeli guarantees it would never reoccupy Gaza, and Israel's insistence that any deal could not leave Hamas intact as a governing and military power. By mid-2025, a significant number of hostages remained in Gaza, some alive, some confirmed dead, some in unknown condition. Each one represents a family in a state of suspended agony. Each one is also a piece on the strategic chessboard that Hamas has used with cold calculation, knowing that the hostages are the one asset that gives them leverage over a militarily superior enemy. The hostage crisis is not a sideshow to the conflict. It is its most human dimension. And how it resolves, whether the remaining hostages come home, whether they are used as human shields until the end, whether some are quietly executed, will shape Israeli society and Israeli politics for a generation. Segment 5. The regional explosion, Hezbollah, Iran, and the wider war. October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. It was not simply a Hamas operation. It was the opening move in a wider regional strategy orchestrated, with varying degrees of directness, by Iran, which has spent 40 years building what it calls the Axis of Resistance, a network of proxy forces across the Middle East designed to encircle and exhaust Israel and project Iranian power throughout the region. Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shiite militia that is simultaneously a political party, a social welfare organization, and a military force of over 100,000 fighters with a missile arsenal larger than most European armies, began attacking northern Israel from Lebanon on October 8th, the day after Hamas's assault. For months, it conducted what it called a support front, daily rocket, drone, and anti-tank missile attacks on Israeli communities in the north, careful to calibrate the attacks below the threshold that would trigger a full Israeli military response, while forcing the evacuation of over 60,000 Israelis from their homes in the Galilee, and keeping Israeli military attention divided between Gaza and the north. That calibration collapsed in the summer and autumn of 2024. Israel, in a series of operations that stunned Hezbollah and the intelligence community alike, executed what became known as the Pager attack, a covert operation that simultaneously detonated explosives hidden in thousands of Hezbollah communication devices, killing and maiming hundreds of operatives in a single day. It then launched a sustained campaign of airstrikes that killed much of Hezbollah's senior leadership, including its Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, arguably the most capable and consequential non-state military commander in the modern Middle East. And then it launched a ground invasion of southern Lebanon. The speed and sophistication of Israel's campaign against Hezbollah revealed the extent to which Israeli intelligence had penetrated Hezbollah's infrastructure over years of patient preparation. But it also triggered the direct Iranian response that the region had been dreading. Iran launched 2 massive ballistic missile and drone attacks directly against Israeli territory, the first time Iran had ever directly attacked Israel from Iranian soil. Israel, with American and Allied assistance, intercepted the vast majority of the projectiles, but the escalation ladder had been climbed in ways that made everyone extremely nervous. A ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah was eventually brokered in late 2024, but it was fragile, contested by both sides, and repeatedly violated. Lebanon was left economically devastated and politically paralyzed, with Hezbollah weakened but not destroyed, and the southern part of the country a wasteland of destroyed villages and unexploded ordnance. The Houthis in Yemen, another Iranian-backed proxy, launched hundreds of drones and missiles toward Israel and began attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea, disrupting global trade routes and drawing American and British military responses. The web of the wider war had spread across the region and into international waters. Iran, throughout this period, has been pursuing nuclear capability with a consistency that reflects its own strategic logic. In a post-October 7th Middle East, with its proxies degraded, its regional position under pressure, and its economy strangled by sanctions, Iran's nuclear program is simultaneously its insurance policy and its ultimate deterrent. American and Israeli intelligence believe Iran has enough enriched uranium for multiple nuclear devices and could weaponize within a matter of months if it made the political decision to do so. That decision, and how Washington and Jerusalem would respond to it, is the single most dangerous variable in the entire Middle Eastern equation. Segment 6. The political crisis. Netanyahu, Biden, and the breaking of the Western consensus. October 7th initially produced something unusual in the fractured landscape of Western politics: unity. Leaders across the political spectrum in the United States, Europe, and beyond declared their solidarity with Israel, their recognition of Israel's right to self-defense, and their condemnation of Hamas. The moral clarity of the immediate aftermath, a democratic state attacked by a terrorist organization that had deliberately massacred civilians, seemed to cut through the usual ambiguities. That unity did not last. It could not last, because the campaign that followed and the images it generated made uncritical support politically unsustainable in democratic societies whose citizens were watching the destruction in real time on their phones. The relationship between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu, 2 leaders with a decades-long personal history, genuine mutual respect, and profound strategic disagreements, became the defining diplomatic drama of the conflict. Biden's administration provided Israel with military support on a scale that was extraordinary, including emergency weapons deliveries in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. But as the civilian death toll in Gaza climbed and the humanitarian crisis deepened, the pressure on Biden from within his own party became intense and eventually politically unmanageable. Young Democratic voters, Arab American communities in key swing states, progressive members of Congress, all demanded that Biden use American leverage to force Israel to limit civilian casualties and allow humanitarian aid. Biden's attempts to do this privately, phone calls to Netanyahu, warnings about specific military operations, threats to condition arms transfers, produced limited results. Netanyahu, politically dependent on far-right coalition partners who would collapse his government if he appeared to be bowing to American pressure, found himself genuinely constrained in his ability to respond to Biden's concerns even when he wanted to. The result was a relationship that deteriorated in real time, with both leaders clearly frustrated with each other but unable to break the fundamental strategic dependency that bound them together. America could not abandon Israel without catastrophic damage to its credibility as an ally. Israel could not defy America beyond a certain point without losing the military and diplomatic support it needed to continue the war. Europe fractured along fault lines that revealed deep differences in how nations read the history of the conflict. Countries like Germany, with its specific historical guilt about the Holocaust, maintained strong support for Israel, even as the humanitarian toll mounted. Countries with large Muslim-majority populations, France, Belgium, Sweden, faced intense domestic political pressure to condemn Israel's military campaign more forcefully. Spain and Ireland became vocal critics of Israeli policy. The European Union, which requires unanimity on foreign policy matters, became increasingly paralyzed. The legal dimension added another layer of crisis. South Africa brought a case before the International Court of Justice, alleging that Israel's campaign in Gaza constituted genocide, a charge Israel rejected with fury as a grotesque distortion of history and a slander against a people who had themselves survived genocide. The ICJ issued interim orders calling for measures to prevent genocidal acts and ensure humanitarian aid, orders that Israel disputed and partially disregarded. The International Criminal